All right, I think the murmuring is beginning to quiet down, so I think that means it's time to get started. So, welcome to the panel on Community Research Partnerships and Data. My name is Mark Rubel. I'm a professor at UC Davis, so I come from the data and science side of things, working on communities and other sorts of interested folks on climate adaptation and other sorts of issues. I fundamentally study how people cooperate in the context of the environment. I've done a lot of work in the Bay Area with some of the folks here. And the question we're asking here is how can we connect communities and science in the most effective way to create and distribute knowledge in ways that empower communities, with the idea that too often science is done in an extractive manner or a transactional manner, where the scientists kind of swoop into the communities, collect some data, publish some papers, and then disappear, and the communities are left without any sort of benefits from that. And we want to try to think about what are the ways that we can move to a more relational model in which science and communities can work together to empower each other, really, because the science can become a lot better with community engagement, and also the communities often need science to help them with the problems they're facing, and scientists can help them complement all that local knowledge that we heard about. So our panelists today all have experience with that, and eventually we'd like to articulate what we think are some of the best practices around that, what are some of the barriers to that, and this includes like what sorts of data sharing can be done, how we might structure data sharing agreements where communities and scientists work together. So how many of you have been in a project where communities and scientists work together? Just raise your hand. Okay, so we've got a decent number of people with some experience in dealing with these challenges, so we'll be happy to hear all your voices. So the first thing I'm going to ask the panelists to do is to introduce themselves and then just give a brief summary of some of the main things that they've done in the context of working at the intersections between communities and science. So I don't want to put words in their mouths for their introduction, so we'll start with Evar. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thanks for being here. My name is Ever Rodriguez, pronouns he, his, and I'm a long-time resident of the community of North Fair Oaks, an unincorporated community between the cities of Redwood City, Menlo Park, and Atherton. Primarily a community of color, about 75% Latino populated. Lots of immigrants, mainly first arrivals. These days we're seeing a lot of immigration coming from Central America, particularly Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, as opposed to what the community got initially when it became, I guess, what the moniker calls Little Mexico, because most of the residents were coming from Mexico, from Aguililla, Michoacan. And so I first got involved with community work as a council member for the body that represents this community before the County of San Mateo. I didn't know that it was an advisory council. So once I learned through the process, I realized that it was a dead end, really, because, as an advisory body, many times, the county ended up doing exactly the opposite of what we recommended, and progress has been pretty slow. So I thought that it would be great to found a community organization, grassroots organization that did not have any restrictions like the council did. And I founded the North Fair Oaks Community Alliance, and we have been working pretty much since the end of 2018, and then our plans got derailed by the pandemic, and we had to be nimble and start helping the community with what COVID brought, all the needs. And all along we have been thinking how to unify the community and provide or get a network that can really unify and protect the community. And we are implementing as we speak a preparedness program for the entire community. Along all of these, the first time we started participating with academic research activity was with Stanford, with Derek Young. He reached out and he asked me if our community members would be interested in finding out about sea level rising. And I told them they would be interested, however, they don't know yet. Because, these days I think sea level rising is in a lot of people's minds, but back then it was nowhere in the radar. And so that was the first collaboration. Then after that, we collaborated also with graduate students and some faculty, also from Stanford, in devising a small study about the feasibility of clean air centers or cooling centers as well as a combination. Because if you may remember, at the end of the pandemic, there were the forest fires in California and Oregon, and we were getting all the smoke in here, and we realized that something needed to be done because the community was essentially trapped. Normally, in an extremely hot day or smoky day, people would have options and would go to the beach, would go to the mall, would go to the movies, but under the pandemic, everything was shut down, including roads to the coast. So being trapped, we started thinking about alternatives, and we realized that we didn't have any community centers that we could use for emergencies such smoky air. My community organization also hosts students, graduates, and undergraduates from Stanford, thanks to the Haas Center for Community Service. We have a partnership going with them, and we always like to support them and appreciate the support that we get from them as well. So I'll leave it at that.
So hard. Can you hear me? So hard act to follow ever. Good morning, everyone. Khalid Osman. I'm an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford. I've been at Stanford now about a year and 2 months, so I'm still fairly new. But a lot of my research program focuses on community-based solutions and community-engaged research. And so currently I have projects across the U.S. mostly looking at infrastructure and how do we improve infrastructure in vulnerable communities. In the Bay Area, I'm working directly with Nuestra Casa on water quality and water aesthetic issues. In Detroit, we're working on water affordability and poor infrastructure and decommissioned infrastructure and how we can develop community-centered, community-informed engineering solutions around those types of issues. In Alabama, I'm working on a sanitation justice and looking at the issues of sanitation they're dealing with in rural Black communities in Alabama. And so a plethora of experience working with community partners, but I'm also continuing to learn through all of these experiences. I think something that was said on stage today is that, the folks who are living and experiencing these infrastructure failures every day, I'm paraphrasing, those weren't the exact words, but they're the experts of their experiences. And so what I'm trying to work on is how do we take those experiences and how they're interacting with infrastructure and create solutions around that. So thank you.
Can y'all hear me? Okay. Hi, I'm Nahala Pakchi. I'm a senior director of the Water and Climate Planning Program at Kearns and West. And I've committed about 15 years of my career to ensuring that the most historically marginalized communities and their voices are included in the water and climate decision-making process. I started by working with tribes up in Washington State and moved down to the Bay Area about 10 years ago, where I was able to support a coalition called the Resilient Communities Initiative, which was a coalition of environmental justice organizations and local leaders working together to build toolkits for government to understand how to work better with communities. And so we did things like environmental justice leadership academies, and we trained government agencies not only in the Bay Area but throughout the whole state of California on how to make themselves more approachable, accessible, and to how to foster stronger relationships with community leaders. And so during that time, I got to work directly with communities in Marin City, Bayview Hunters Point, West Oakland, pretty much all of the communities that we would now consider DACs or LIDACs or whatever acronym you want to use. And so I learned a lot from what I call my elders. And since then, it's been just my duty now, my privilege and my duty to continue carrying those messages and those lessons forward. I've done so through my role as BCDC's original environmental justice program manager. I did that for about 3 years and helped BCDC create a really strong environmental justice and social equity program. And then after that, I went on and worked at a national nonprofit to help actually ensure that the IIJA, or I don't ever remember what that stands for, but the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law funding, the funding that goes towards water, so the SRF funds, is invested as equitably as possible. So I was able to advocate for some implementation strategies that were adopted by the EPA to then be directing how those investments are made in mostly small water systems in rural communities. And so, but I really missed working with my Bay Area friends and family. And so I ended up coming back, and now I'm at Kearns and West. And I'm able to work with folks like Julio Garcia with Rise South City, and with other local leaders on issues related to environmental justice. So we're working together with the Bay Air Center on helping Julio build capacity in South San Francisco around air quality monitoring and understanding the technical skills required to understand the monitoring networks and to then design their own solutions to air quality impacts and health impacts. So that's just an example of one of the projects that I'm supporting in my role as a bridge builder and a facilitator. Thank you.
Is it on? Yeah. I am Mark Stacy. I'm in civil environmental engineering, professor at UC Berkeley. Although I'm in engineering now, I would say my formative years were more in the natural and physical sciences. And so in the early parts of my career, I thought a lot about the interplay between people and the environment, thinking mostly about how people are impacting the environment and the impacts on ecosystems. Over the last 15 to 20 years, that dynamic has shifted a little bit. As one of the speakers this morning said, Mother Nature is fighting back. And I'm now thinking about the impact of the environment on people. That's led me into a variety of conversations around the Bay Area, particularly centered on sea level rise, but touching on other climate issues as well. The research that I've done in that space examined how environmental processes, how infrastructure systems, and people interact in the Bay Area and how impacts from climate change and sea level rise cascade through the region. And what that leads to are interactions and interdependencies where the actions of one community can't be considered in isolation and needs to be thought of in the context of the rest of the region and other communities. And so when I hear a comment, it really resonates with me that sea level rise is something that people in these Bayfront communities will care about, but they don't know yet. Combined with the issues that Khalid highlighted around drinking water and sanitation, there are urgent issues in these communities, and sea level rise still feels distant. But decisions are being made regionally and in other communities that shape the trajectory. So I found myself in conversations, panels like this, discussions with regional agencies, talking about a shared future and trying to understand that path. I would say when we turn to the idea of funded research and data and so on, that's been a lot harder. The work I've done has been funded through federal agencies and is not centered community engagement. The funding started before that was really an activity that we were all engaged with. And there are a lot of barriers to funding those partnered projects, and I hope we have a chance to talk more about that. But I would say that the starting point is the people and the relationships and understanding the different perspectives in the region, and that's what I've been working towards. So I look forward to the discussion today. So.
All right, thanks for the introduction, folks. So what we're going to turn to now is trying to get at some of the things that Mark Stacy alluded to, which is what are some of the barriers to community-based research partnerships, what are some of the keys to success, and I suppose it's worth starting with some sort of definition of what it might be, and I guess I'll just offer my own, is that when we have a community-based research partnership, that we have community members and scientists, and not necessarily always from universities, since we have a lot of science-based NGOs as well, and agency scientists around, but in the same space, trying to do some science, develop knowledge. Often what the scientists get out of that process is different from what the communities. There's some misalignment in the incentives. What do we need for our careers as scientists is to publish papers. When we put that up to the deans of our bosses, that's kind of all they care about. We have those sorts of challenges to deal with. So let's hear from based on your experience, what are some of the keys to success to getting the best that we can out of those partnerships for both sides, the scientists and the communities, and what are some of the main barriers? And we'll just start in the same order on that.
Sounds good. Yeah. Based on my experience, I've kind of made a list of the most salient things that I've noticed in the collaborations that I've had, with academic researchers. And one of them, and probably the most important for me as a community stakeholder, I don't like to use the word leader because it's too heavy for me. That's up to the people to give me that name, not for me to take it. But anyway, the first one would be to design research around benefiting the community, because many times that's not the case. Scholars come with their research needs, and they can be very specific. They have time constraints, labor-related, kind of constraints as well. And so, but from a community perspective, that would be number one. Then I think that making the process clear, transparent, and easier for community participants would be number two, because we have finite resources. We don't have a lot of time either. In my particular case, I have a full-time job that has nothing to do with community work, and I can only work, for my community on weekends and after my job. And then another thing would be not to rely on community-based organizations' time or ability to do the legwork. For the same reason that we have finite resources and time. And finally, I think to give credit to the community or to community-based organization or individuals who participate. And for this, I'd like to use the example that I mentioned earlier when I participated with Ryan Travis, a graduate from Stanford University. He conducted the research about the feasibility of a cleaner center in North Faroes, conducted interviews, etc., wrote the paper, but he was nice enough to include me as an author, as a co-author, for that paper. And I don't necessarily see it as seeing my name as part of the as a co-author, but I see it as identifying that a community participated in that research directly. That's how I see it. And that was something that I wasn't expecting. I didn't ask for it, and yet he offered, along with the other researchers that participated. And I think that that builds a bridge for continued collaboration, but also gives recognition to whatever work I ended up doing for that particular collaboration. Now, in terms of what would be some of the barriers, I think that the design of research that is mainly based on individual gains rather than mutual gains, it can be detrimental. As it was mentioned before, research that can be extractive and or dismissive. You would hear from many people in the community of East Palo Alto about, being fed up of Stanford coming to dig out research, and people no longer wanting to participate. I think the dynamics are changing these days, but at some point you would hear that, all the time among community-based organizations and the community itself. And then another thing that that could be detrimental could be that the timing is typically based on the academic needs. And if students have, or researchers have, a quarter only to work on this particular issue, things get left hanging many times. They don't get completed, or it feels rushed or pressured, and that sort of thing. Yeah, and to be self-critical about community organizations, I think that something that I also learned is that we need to make, as community-based organizations, we need to make a better effort at trying to figure out what students and faculty need to be exposed that is going to help them not only to answer the research questions, but also to give them an added perspective of an expanded problem. Because many times research investigation can be very specific, but I think that if a broader perspective is brought in by community members who have experience in certain issues, I think that could enrich the research, or sometimes make it easier. So, yeah.
Awesome. That's a great list of things. I think you should maybe just write a paper about that. Maybe not in a journal, academic journal. Not that many people actually read those. So, Khalid, you want to follow up on that? Maybe, you talked about Stanford changing the relationship in East Palo Alto. Maybe you've experienced that.
Sure, yeah. No, it's always hard to follow ever. You've got these comprehensive things that every time I write a note, I'm having to cross it off because you've already covered it. But I do think, one of the things that you alluded to, but I'd like to sort of emphasize is building early relationships. It's really hard to approach a community organization 2 weeks before a proposal is due and say, hey, I really need a community organization on this proposal. Would you like to join? Especially if you haven't built that early relationship and trust with that community. And so I would say one of the key factors for success is early relationship building, because early relationship building allows you to use the tenets of good community-engaged research, which are co-development and co-sponsored research. The other thing I have written in my notes is just listening. I think that's something that I've been practicing here today, and part of building early relationships is really listening to the community in terms of what are their challenges and how do they align with what you are trying to accomplish in your research program, and how can you create self-advocacy around the issues that they're dealing with. One of the other notes I have down here is equal partnerships, and that means transparent budgets, and also in a lot of the grants that I've written, I have community partners as co-PIs, not just as partners, and I think that's really helped in terms of leveling the playing field and really honoring their presence as equal partners on projects. The other key to success is making sure that all information is reported back to the community in a way that's comprehensible. One of the things I think Ever also talked about is extractiveness, and you had mentioned it too. Extractiveness is one of the reasons people get turned away from wanting to participate in research with researchers or anyone that's coming in to sort of just analyze them and not give them back anything that they've analyzed. And so I think making sure we're reporting back in a comprehensible way, the same way that we came in and conducted studies to extract information, we should be giving it back. That'll also come up later as a barrier. You know, data sharing is a huge hurdle, but I'll talk about that in barriers. And then the last thing is acknowledgement. I think there's several ways to acknowledge the support that you've received from community partners, and one of those ways is co-authorship. Another way is co-developing research. But also, most of our papers have acknowledgement sections, and if you look at a lot of the papers that are published today on environmental research in places where they've been in communities and worked with communities, you don't see a lot of acknowledgements to those communities. And I think that's one place that we really messed up on as researchers. That would have been an easy plug for a lot of the efforts that community organizations put in. As far as barriers go, I think timelines are always a huge barrier that I'm learning this year. You know, we're often given 2 to 3 months to prepare a really solid proposal, and that's often not a good enough timeline to develop solid relationships. And so I think the relationship building has to come way before the project comes to fruition. And so I would say timelines are tough. I think institutional preparedness, and Mark, maybe you can talk about this a little bit, but I've only been at Stanford for a year, but I sort of feel like the institution as a whole is not truly prepared for community-engaged research. And that, I think, from my perspective, in working with IRB, and understanding how funding works and understanding how do we, allocate resources to our community partners, all of those systems are a little difficult to navigate. They're not streamlined, and that just made me feel like the institution itself, community-engaged research is something new that they're not prepared for and are now learning to navigate. But also getting across institutional barriers is always going to be a really long process, and so this is not something I expect to be solved today or tomorrow, but I'd hope in the next 5-10 years we have some better frameworks in place. And one of the key institutional barriers, in my opinion, that I've had an issue with in the projects I'm working on is data sharing. We collect all this data from the communities, but we're not allowed to give it back to them in an identifiable manner. We have to de-identify and strip it down to bare bones, and then that's what we can share with the community. But I think community partners, if they're equal partners in the research, should have access to identifiable data that they can use for their own self-advocacy and to support their communities. That's all the things that I've had. Thank you.
Worked on both sides of the equation, trying to bring the science and the policy and the communities together. So what are your observations on the successes and barriers? Give us the magic sauce.
Well, actually, I'll probably repeat what my fellow panelists have already shared, but I do think that the fundamental factor for success is establishing trust, which sounds like a simple, response, but it's actually that's the fundamental goal of research partnerships being successful is to actually establish trust. So I have some recommendations on steps that you could take to get there. So we've already talked about the relational model, but real relationships, because I've seen people try to do relational, and you can tell the difference between it being transactional with a relational facade. And so that means a clear effort from the researcher to understand the goals and the mission of the local and community-based partners, making the trip out to the local partners' home and offices and communities, going, if they don't have an office, find a room at a local library that they live by so that they can show you who they are and where they're from. Understanding the culture requires you going there in person and learning about upcoming community events and meetings and actually asking them if they need volunteers and finding either yourself, finding your own time, or finding students that you can send to support their efforts, because that shows that you're putting their goals and missions before your own, and that'll help create a trusting relationship. Do your research, learn about the organization's history, find articles or holistic community data on their history, do a specific focus on environmental justice related issues, but also just think outside the box: political history, economic history. Be informed. Believe me, they'll notice if you come to them informed versus asking them from scratch to explain their entire story. These small acts will make a huge impact on the fundamental goal, which is the work that I do, which is just, I believe in establishing trust and for it to be authentic. And the main barrier that I've actually seen that sometimes gets me down to the point of wondering if I want to do this anymore is the lack of will from senior level positions. I just don't see that level of buy-in from senior staff at agencies or any of the academic. I'm not speaking to the director level people here, but to get that buy-in from the top of the ladder decision makers, I just haven't really seen that as much. And so, if you have your research associates or entry-level staff focusing on community concerns and goals, that's great. But it's obvious when their supervisor or the department directors are not fully bought in. And it doesn't feel like it's worth the community leader's time, especially when the community-based organization is sending their executive directors to meetings, and then they're meeting with like an entry-level, staff. It's an obvious power dynamic that is not appealing at all. And another barrier is just understanding your own institution's history, working with communities. I've learned about researchers at institutions who, as has already been mentioned, have done long-term studies alongside community leaders, and when the final report came out, the community didn't even get an acknowledgement. So I do believe that what Ever said about him being listed as a co-author on the report that he supported should be common practice. And so, of course, as other people have mentioned, funding is always going to be a barrier, especially from my perspective. I've seen that government and academia have a long list of barriers that are kind of administrative and really bureaucratic barriers to why they can't compensate communities for their time and involvement. So that's something that it's like in my role when I worked at a state agency, I was tempted to just go to Cal HR and I was trying to find a way to go to the entity that all the agencies were pointing to as the reason why they couldn't figure out a more streamlined funding process to be able to compensate community leaders for their time beyond just these stipends and honorariums that never are enough money to compensate them for their actual time. And that I think that we need to figure out those workarounds before actually starting to talk to communities, so it's clear, as Khalid already mentioned, like that budget process is already clear and laid out ahead of the discussion, so that they can see that you thought about them before, not after.
This is certainly fundamental, and I'm sure that Mark Stacey's going to have something to say about university leadership and administration around this.
Sure. I have so many thoughts swirling in my head. Mostly it's just ditto. The comments are fantastic across the whole panel here. I'm trying to think how to walk into. Here's my notes. It's a bit of a mess. Maybe I'll start with the institutional preparedness. I spent 5 years as department chair at Berkeley, finished this summer. And so as department chair, you're the interface between individual faculty and the rest of the institution. And you really get direct insights into the challenges that those faculty face and, frankly, the lack of institutional preparedness. The right words are being said. UC Berkeley has established a new set of criteria that can be considered in faculty promotion cases around impact broadly. And so it's not just scientific impact, what journals are you publishing in, but it can be measured in many other ways. But that's the hard part, the measuring of it. Because when it gets to those cases, you have to be able to point to the impact that the work had in a very explicit way. And that's not really been clearly defined yet. And I don't think institutionally we've worked through what that does look like. They're saying things like, if you can point to your work directly influencing a policy outcome, that's check, plus. That could take years. That could take decades. and these promotion cases are every 2 years. So how do we come back to this idea of the misaligned timescales. So I think institutionally, I think there is interest in supporting this work. I don't know how much will there is to really work through these thorny details. The easier path is to just say, what journals did you publish in and how widely read are they, and that's your impact. The other side on and I'll come back to institutional preparedness in a moment on the university side, but I do want to comment on the funding agency side. Because over the last 5 years, maybe, funding agencies have started to highlight more the role that community engagement can and should play in this type of work. I don't think they really know what that means. I don't think there are too many layers removed to understand what that takes in terms of resources, what it takes in terms of time, and what it means for the type of work that will be done. If you're working with a specific community on research, you're not going to be working on a theoretical problem that's going to be valid worldwide. You're working on an applied problem that has a local impact. National Science Foundation may not actually be interested in that. They'll say that they are, but they might want something that's nationally relevant, that's not locally defined. And bridging that divide is an ongoing challenge, I think, as we try to develop these partnerships. How do you take something that is very local, that is very rooted in the conditions in that community, and make it relevant more broadly, and make it of interest to these national agencies or international agencies. On the institutional side, to speak to the barriers a little bit more, I mentioned individual faculty getting credit for that work and the gap that's there. They also don't have the support institutionally that they need to really make the partnerships go. There are barriers put in place by every large institution, whether academic or not, and the University of California is a big institution. Requirements around contracting, insurance requirements, barriers to making payments to individuals versus organizations. It is just administrative hurdle after administrative hurdle to try to make this work happen. And these are individual faculty who are trying to develop new courses, develop new research, trying to launch their careers while simultaneously trying to navigate this labyrinth administratively to make the work happen. And it falls on individual shoulders too much to work that out. And what that leads to, unfortunately, is I think what Ever may have commented on, a lack of continuity and engagement. That as those individuals are trying to do all of these things, they are pulled in too many directions to maintain that ongoing, strong, deep relationship that is needed to develop the trust, to maintain the trust. And so they're getting pulled in all these different directions as well, and the incentives aren't necessarily aligned for them all the time. And that can lead to inconsistent communication, and that erodes trust. I don't have a solution for any of this, other than I hope our institutions start to actually put more resources behind the words. I hope we have a sponsored projects office that works with campus-wide, deals with proposals as they go out and manages the sort of contracts as they flow back and forth. We need a sponsored partnerships office as well to specifically focus on these partnerships, and that doesn't exist. But those are the institutional issues. I would just, at the individual level, I'll wrap up, sorry. You got me going on institutional stuff. So at the individual level, I want to just follow up on the comment about timelines and timescales, because especially when we're thinking about funded research to develop new data and new insights and new knowledge jointly. We could work for several months, maybe longer, developing a relationship, developing a proposal, and it might sing. It might be an awesome proposal. And we submit it to the agency, and then we sit and wait. 6 months, 9 months, possibly a year in some cases, to hear back on that proposal. And what's happening during that intervening time? The relationship could drop back somewhat. You don't have the resources to continue it. You're also thinking about other proposals, other classes, and so on. But that one, you really believed in it, you wanted it to go, and now you're sitting waiting and waiting and waiting. And then it's not funded. And so you're starting over. And on the academic side, that's the game that we play. We place these bets. They don't get funded. We come back and do it again. But this means it could take several years before this partnership emerges into something that's funded. And that is an eternity from the community side. And again, it erodes trust. So we have these mismatches all over the place where even with the best of intentions, things can get sideways quickly. The opportunity, though, and I'll just finish with that, is the opportunity to do research that is grounded in real-world impacts and real-world benefits is something that I think many people in academics are seeking, independent of whether funding agencies or their institutions support it. That's the type of work that they want to be doing, and they're trying to find ways to do it, in spite of their institutions and in spite of some of these other barriers. So.
Awesome, thank you. So I noticed you turned sponsored projects office into sponsored partnership office by accident. So maybe we can start with a name change.
No, it's not by accident. I said we need a sponsored partnership office to go along with the sponsorship.
It might take us a couple of years to get a name change, but that's...
It's a second office.
Yes. Okay. That'll take even longer. So time is flowing away. We're definitely would like to hear from the group out here collectively about some of your questions, but one very specific thing that folks were interested in is data sharing agreements as a specific, very concrete aspect of research partnerships. So I'll just kind of if anybody would like to give a brief comment, and keep it brief this time because we want to hear from everybody else about what makes a good data sharing agreement or one key ingredient that we should think about. Just go for it.
I can just mention briefly a couple of keywords. One would be using or giving the ability of utilizing anonymous subjects rather than including as much personal data as possible. Then having the data secured to the satisfaction of the community participants. And then one final comment, and this one is for community-based organizations. We are not the middleman connecting academia with community members. We are actually community members, and as such, we need to be advocates for that community because many times we are actually the middleman, and we end up not caring for the privacy or the protection or benefits of the community, but we need to start doing that if we are not doing that.
Just a short comment from me would be reduce the jargon in the agreements. I think one of the challenges I had in developing partnership and data sharing agreements is they felt like legal documents, and I think that was sort of a barrier of trust building between the community partners and I. And so figuring out ways that we can turn those agreements into something that everybody can understand without having a lawyer sitting next to them.
Mine was similar to Khalid's, as to have someone, if they're like a translator in a way of the jargon, or to just have it begin from the very beginning to be a co-led agreement so that it's designed and developed collaboratively. It takes longer, but then both sides' perspectives are equally included. And maybe not a lawyer, but some kind of facilitator would be helpful in that process. But yeah, I'll pass it to Mark.
Yeah, I could echo those items. I'll just mention one other thing from the academic researcher side. Increasingly, when authors submit papers to be reviewed, they have to actually release the data at that time and make it publicly available, widely available. And that's a real vulnerability for those researchers because their work isn't even published yet. It's just in the review stage, but they have to sort of lay that data out to others. And that now needs to be a part of data agreements as well, I think, because even in the pre-publication stage, what do we do with the data? When do we release it? And how does that process get supported?
Awesome. So we had a grand plan of breakout groups and stuff like that, but I predicted it would take too long, so we're going to skip that, and let's just take some questions from the audience based on your own experience, what you heard up here about the barriers and key ingredients to getting this community-based partnership. So just raise your hand and I'll call on people. Go ahead.
Josh Hudson, Peninsula Regional Open Space District. It seems like, there was talk of kind of an extractive relationship going on here. And I guess two things, just two quick thoughts. One, are there opportunities to turn any of this engagement into workforce development opportunities to help build skill sets that the community can use beyond the research? And the other one was, because I've seen this in previous studies, I used to work in the housing space. Research was not just brought back to the individual participants, but also to the local policymakers. So a presentation by the scientists to the local elected officials to hopefully, as was said before, trying to create a policy.
We were going to ask a question about how the researchers and the scientists and the community members can work together to empower and to make policy change. So thank you for asking that question. So anybody like to take on that?
I think you've really kind of hit an idea straight on there, which is essentially through that partnership finding the advocacy opportunities. And sometimes it's the scientific findings and sometimes it's other findings. But to then explicitly bring that back to influence policy, I think, is the key next step. On the workforce development side, I think I would just say yes, that can absolutely be a part of thinking about partnerships, depending on the situation, depending on the two partners that are involved.
Hi Josh, good to see you. I actually I wanted to give the microphone to Mr. Garcia over here because on the workforce topic, that's always seems like the goal, right? Like every time you do a research partnership, you're like, and then we're going to get a funded full-time role of a community member that becomes our technical expert on the topic that the researcher built our capacity around. So that's kind of the structure that I see from you every time we write proposals. So if you want the expert in the room, we can talk to that. But then on the policy side, I loved what you said as well. I agree with that. And then I would just add that instead of just having the scientists do the presentation in front of policymakers, actually having their own constituents present is, again, something that Rise South City does at local decision-making and planning meetings. Thanks.
Awesome.
Can I add just my 2 cents about that? I think that from the community perspective, if research is designed around benefiting the community, this becomes an asset, an argument for policy changing, and also an opportunity for more and better civic engagement. So definitely opportunities for community members to get involved and perhaps even make a profit. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Julie, you want to stand up and say something as well?
Thank you, Nahal. So you go to the table. I mean, for us, it's really important that everything that we do we have works for development. But here's the how we deal every day. It's like you get funded for 1 year, you hire a person for 1 year, and after that, what is going to happen? I think that we need to talk about multi-year funding, multi-positions funding, and all that. Because we just got funding for 1 year, we hire that person. It takes like about 6 to 7 months to train that person to put them in position. And what is going to happen in the next 4 months? You're going again, to lose that person. I mean, it's fine to have, we have interns right here with us. They spend the summer with. We have interns that will spend 9 to 10 months, but they're gone, and we cannot hire. That's one of the issues that we have in community because we don't have enough funding to hire them. In terms of data, we have a great partnership with Berkeley and Stanford. Berkeley is helping us extract the data for their quality right here in this Palo Alto, and Stanford is putting all this together, all these numbers together to make sense to us. But since the very beginning, we had this conversation. Who owns the data? The community owns the data. Berkeley and Stanford are very clear about it, and they are helping us to do this. And in terms of allocating, I think we are training the community right now to allocate for themselves. When we have that data, those numbers together, then we have the community allocating for better quality in South San Francisco. And what better to see like 100 people fighting for air quality and better health issues than to see me and Francesca and a couple more people that are on the roads. So that's
So I have to just mention a name. Julio mentioned Berkeley's involvement with air quality and the way that work is forefronting the data agreement and the partnership with the community. This is being led by Professor Sunny Ivy, faculty member at Berkeley, who couldn't be here today. She should be sitting in my seat, to be totally honest. But I want to just mention her and her involvement with that because she's such a strong force in that partnership. And she's one of the people trying to navigate all those administrative hurdles to make it happen.
So there's a term, I think, actually tribal data sharing and community-based partnerships are very strong in this with this term data sovereignty, this concept of data sovereignty and best practices around data sovereignty. It's some stuff that I had to work into a grant recently to fully appreciate how to develop those relationships and had to learn some more about, so I will recommend that term as a concept to look up in the context of tribal work. So what other questions do we have out here? Go ahead. Stand up if you will. It's kind of hard to hear.
Hi, my name's Omar. I'm a graduate student at Stanford. And this is, I guess, more about the research side, like conversing with my peers and professors about sort of community partnerships and working with communities. A lot of sometimes they bring up their hesitation, and it may just be a cop-out, but they bring up the idea of unintended consequences of the work and the data that might reveal some things that would do more harm than good, that would cause sort of litigation or relocation of a community because they found 4 times the safety level of lead and soil and stuff like that. So how have you guys been addressing that question of unintended consequences?
Unintended consequences. Data's out in the wild and you don't know exactly what might happen.
How about unintended benefits? I mean, I think that to not pursue research because you're afraid you might find something bad is a consequence right away. If you use the example of lead in the soil, I think you'd want to know, right? And to keep it buried is, that's not being a responsible steward. So I think, I guess I just would come from a place of trying to find the truth, trying to find what's there, and sharing in that with the community. It's a foreign perspective to me, so I'm trying to kind of find that perspective. So.
I can just add similar that I always advocate for radical transparency. So if that's a concern of researchers, they should just be straight up because you're talking to adults, like they're not little kids. And so just trust that if you're transparent, again, that builds trust. So just explaining up front, it's a slight possibility that you're signing up for something that could have this impact. And then they probably will still want to proceed because, as Mark already said, they want to know that there's too much lead in the soil where they live. So, yeah, I just think move ahead, charge ahead.
Yeah, I would also say a part of doing research in communities is to empower self-advocacy. And so we can't, what we do is provide the data and the analysis and the knowledge, but the decision-making happens at different levels. And so I do think communities can make decisions for themselves, but I would rather have the knowledge than not have the knowledge.
I will say that not everybody wants to know the problems. UC Davis did a big study on nitrogen in the Central Valley. Discovered shockingly that agriculture is responsible for putting a lot of nitrates into the groundwater in the Central Valley, and the farmers did not want to know that, right? Because they wanted to keep their head in the sand. So even now, when I go out and work with agriculture, it's one of the things I do. And they know I'm from UC Davis. They wonder, the agricultural communities wonder, are you going to find something that we're doing wrong? There's a trust issue there. It's not, there's EJ issues there, but this is with different communities. So there's the politics of knowledge is not something that is always clear.
Yeah,
right,
you made me,
let's see.
If I can add one more.
Yeah, I just want to push back a little bit that we have to have the resources. This is reminding me of health fairs. Like, what is the point of telling somebody they have diabetes if we're not going to connect them to health care or whatever they need to, deal with the social determinants of health or whatever. So I think, I don't want to speak for the person who asked the question, but it's like we have to be more responsible in having connections to those resources, like making sure people get what they need, or in like an extreme situation, if they have to leave their home, who's going to help them? Mm-hmm. So,
the science should not be just about finding problems.
Right,
the science should also be done to find solutions.
Well, if we're working in partnership, I think it works, right? But
okay, stand up, please. So we can
Hi, my name is Mark Dine. I'm in East Palo Alto, and I guess you just raised a point that is really interesting. East Palo Alto has a lot of issues, and one of the issues is scientific measurement. We don't have a weather station. We have to rely on Redwood City's weather station for our air quality. So in 2020, I led a project with neighbors to buy a bunch of air sensors, purple air sensors. And I was asking the city, why don't we have this? And this is Michelle Dare, if anyone knows her. She gave me the backstory, which was like the city didn't want to know what the air quality was because of a lot of different issues. One of those commute traffic, maybe. If you know about a problem, you can remediate a problem. I know you're working on water in East Palo Alto. You want to talk about a hornet's nest of politics and power and influence. There's people who don't want to know what the water quality is in East Palo Alto, and they're making money off of it. And they're going to fight you. They're going to sue you. I've been deposed for about this. They're going to take legal action on anybody who speaks out about water quality. And so, I think from an academic perspective, I understand why people in Stanford don't actually engage in East Palo Alto. It can be really toxic. And there's people both at the governmental level and at the private level, when we're talking about these water districts or the sanitary districts, which have big issues. And they have money, power, and influence in the community, and they're pushing back against any investigation or oversight or any scientific, these are what the facts are. So I think it's an interesting issue. I'd be curious how you handle local pushback. It sounds like you have experience with that in the Central Valley. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, how you handle local pushback. I will say I think one of the benefits of bringing university scientists into this, there's kind of a myth, at least, of objectivity there that helps say, all right, well, it's not just your scientists are also saying it, so that helps resist. But what other experiences have you had with pushback on the data and how to deal with that?
I actually haven't had that experience yet. So I'm hoping, when we conclude the project next December, that's not the case. But yeah, I'd love to hear from maybe the rest of the panel on ways I can prepare for that looking forward.
I can quickly share, both of the examples, like your example about the farmers and then yours about the political pushback. it's not the community that you're speaking on behalf of. I don't think that I know that they're the farmer, like but they're also capitalizing off the land and off of the pollution. So I don't see them as my priority audience when I say radical transparency is critical. So I'm always speaking to the underrepresented, the communities that are not the reason why we have to address these, pollution and other types of environmental impacts. So I'm trying to support them, and in that position, I have to be as transparent as possible, even if it means my own safety is at stake. I have a meeting coming up in Hanford, California, to represent the State Water Board for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Probationary Basins, and I will be facilitating a meeting where I'm sure that there will be hundreds of farmers up in arms, not happy with the fact that the Water Board is telling them they have to reduce their extraction rates. And we're potentially calling the local law enforcement to come be at the meeting just in case. So you have to just be brave and tell the truth.
Can I add a comment? In terms of pushback from the community, I think that happens when research or government program implementation circumvents the community that they are trying to do research about or serve. Because all of a sudden, they were never informed that there was lead in the soil. It's just they get informed when they have to vacate their homes. If they are considered from the get-go and they're told about the possibility of them getting, evicted or losing their homes, they can at least evaluate whether they want to participate or not. I think most likely they would, because they are the primary targets for, illnesses and health issues. And so, but circumventing the communities and, just bombing them with the surprise that either they have to vacate or not work the land, etc. I think that's, first of all, this is typical from this system that needs to change, but also this is detrimental to communities.
Mark, you want to comment on any pushback?
I guess I'm thinking about the examples that have been given here around air quality in East Palo Alto or the nitrates. And I think the people who are saying we don't want to know actually already do know. They don't want the evidence to be surfaced. And that's a very different thing from not wanting to know.
I thought it was interesting, some of the research that you and I did, where we showed that there were cascading infrastructure impacts, that some local communities would say, hey, that city shouldn't do anything, because if that city does anything, it's going to push water to us. And we weren't expecting that sort of use of the data, but people picked up on that. All right, so other question. I think I saw one over here. Can you stand up, please?
Yeah, more of a comment to the question that was posed around faculty or staff not really wanting to delve into bringing in the community for unintended consequences. My background, my name is Marla Tempoyo. I grew up at UPA, went to UCR, studied disability studies, and one of the things that I learned around that was in a class about anthropology around medicine, and how there were anthropologists that would go at the Amazon and learn about medicines, natural medicines, and how they would bring that data back and that knowledge, and then the industry here would create a synthetic version of that and make huge profits while the people that had and created that knowledge weren't recognized for it. And so then there was another anthropologist that he didn't want to do that. I don't know his name, but he has a whole researching about it. And what he ended up doing was that he didn't share any of that information that he learned, but he created a workforce and a school for them to continue to pass along the knowledge and take care of themselves and self-determination and doing that. So I wanted to share that.
Sounds like an interesting model, good beneficial model. What other questions based on your experiences? Don't be shy.
Larry Staley, Foster City, member of our city's Sustainability Council. I'm going to make Mark's comments on the funding itself. I wonder if anybody's had experience with it's become one of the big areas of the federal government, SBIR, the Innovative Research Grant, and I've heard good things about it, and I've looked in with some colleagues. I've also heard some, like you said, Mark, horrible bureaucratic administrative things that we are waiting for, as you say, up to a year or so. Has anybody had experience with SBIR or funds like that, particularly from the federal government?
The SBIR is research projects that center small businesses. Unfortunately, the work I do doesn't have much profit in it, and so I haven't directly connected to it. And I think actually in a lot of these issues that we are talking around on the environmental side, the profit incentive is not there to drive small business, to drive commercialization. And that's the thing I was actually kind of thinking about and talking about the funding agency's priorities. 20-ish years ago and prior to that, commercialization was a way they would measure impact. And I think they are trying to turn that tanker and think about impact differently, but I don't think they know how to yet. And I think the SBIR is a little bit of a vestige of that previous sort of thinking about, like, you know, we'll measure impact by sort of the future profits or the ability to launch a business around it. That's at least my experience with it.
If I may, I'll bring government into the conversation because there's an awful lot of red tape to the extent that many community-based organizations are reluctant to work with local government, essentially because the applications can be so overwhelming and the requirements too, they can be very, in my view, excessively elaborate. And so many times we run to philanthropy because philanthropy seems to understand better not only the work of the community-based organizations, but the issues and the end result. And so, you know, I don't think that academia is alone in, you know, dealing with that red tape. Government does the same, and yeah, it needs to be changed.
I mean, I think an important thing, the diversity, there is a diversity of funding sources, but there's a general problem that when you go to Washington, D.C., and grants like Mark and I might write are reviewed, the program managers have no idea what's going on in the communities, the reviewers they bring in have no idea what's going on in the communities, so they can't evaluate it. Just one example for myself is I did a recent climate adaptation one. We talked about working with tribes, and one of the reviewers was, well, they mentioned tribes. My understanding is that, you know, tribes in the Pacific Northwest have equal sharing of the fisheries, and that's all they said. And because we didn't mention that specifically, they said we didn't do an adequate job of addressing tribal relationships. So the reviewer has no idea of the diversity of tribes in the West Coast. They just had that one little thing in their head that they probably read in the newspaper somewhere. So that distance between the reviewers and the communities is a big deal. All right, so what other questions? We've got a few minutes left. So there in the far, my right. Yeah.
My name is Alisa. I'm actually a grad student at UC Santa Cruz, but I'm from the Pacific Islands. I'm a neighbor to Violet. In fact, that's how I got roped into this. I'm kind of in the middle where I have to be an advocate for my island communities and dealing with what you were just explaining. It's my reality. It's not a shared picture of issues. But my comes to your issue is trying to find the intersectionality between climate change and fisheries, and that's basically what I have to do, is explain to the folks, unfortunately in DC, I have the luxury to sit on the Capitol Hill, is to say, look, fisheries is being impacted by the stock is going down. That impacts our food security. So we need to kind of explain. It comes to the issue of being a translator and an advocate. And I really appreciate if there's any examples of that, because I'm stuck in that multi-path that I have to kind of be mindful of that. And with this community, I'm part of that, but then they're also going to see me coming from as a researcher and being mindful of not being extractive, being very respectful, giving back to the community, but also understanding that I have to be following all of the administrative headache. And trying to navigate those really troublesome waters. Thank you.
Any comments on strategies about how to sit in that boundary spanning space, and even as an individual?
All I can say is I know someone who's going through the exact same thing, and I will put you in touch with him. He's a native Alaskan who's trying to work on energy reliability in rural Alaska, and I will make the connection.
Anybody else spanning that, sitting that very thorny fence? No. Any other questions? 5 minutes left. Yeah. Sorry. Yes, sir.
My name is Senta Wilomulangi, and I'm from Anamatan Polynesian Voices. As we listen to you today, it seems like that we are hanging on the edge of the cliff in everything. I'm going to speak on 2 areas. One, the island nation is underwater. I'm from Tonga, and I see the study when the Honga Tonga Honga Hapai erupted in January 15 last year. The whole world was shocked. And I went to Tonga, go all the way from Tonga to Alaska. It wake up, and I seen the study was done in Berkeley about this volcano. But I'm talking about, as we are talking here, the island nation is underwater. Every moment is going down. Some of the island is gone. I think we all know that. That's global. In my backyard, I have the Greek, San Fernando Greek. They fix it, and the job is done. But what is not done, the FEMA is not releasing our sea level, flood level, whatever certificate, and we still suffer for pain because we are in the flood area. And I don't know where is all this study goes to tell FEMA to release. Because I live behind that place since 1982. Flood 82. Flood 2002, flood on 2012, and I'm still there. So the question, all this study, can we prove it to the FEMA to release that? And the other thing is, the island nation kept the short part of this thing. It's less funding, so I think the government is want us to do a Mickey Mouse job. As I said, we are hanging, and the island is sinking. Thank you very much.
So, I mean, certainly the time frame is now, right? Science often doesn't operate at the now, sadly, which is one of the big challenges. But the other challenge I think you mentioned, we may have the perfect science, the perfect community-based partnerships, but actually getting policymakers to pay attention and make a change on the basis of that is far from given. So, any comments from the panel on how to deal with those sorts of issues?
Yeah, I think that, in my experience, there are many actors in our society that don't seem to have this sense of urgency that, for example, people living in the Pacific Islands have. For obvious reasons, they're not sinking, their homes are not underwater yet. And those actors, you can find them, in academia, in government, and for example, I don't see the same sense of urgency in academia, for example, in schools of business or law, as I see it in obviously the natural sciences, but engineering is a really good example, that they seem to be, all types of engineering, very well invested into some sort of climate change or environmentally related topic. And I think in government as well, there are a few departments that make decisions on a daily basis, like public works and planning and building, and yet, they are left and doing the work as if nothing was happening to the environment. And, some departments specifically need to be brought in, and have a reality check, because the things that they have done in the past, that they continue to do, are obviously very toxic, and, they need to radically change.
30 seconds. Now I hesitate.
No, I was
calling
like 30 seconds. I was pointing.
Any last comments?
Well, I think that, when we're talking about like the FEMA issue, I think that's exactly coming back to the very first question and comment, is how can we get the information that comes out of research studies in front of the people making the decisions that will actually affect the quality of life. Whether it's a presentation to them, whether it's sharing the report in a particular way. I don't know the details of that case, but I think it kind of speaks to that need to sort of close that loop.
All right, awesome. So we are out of time. Thank the panelists.